Hi, and welcome back to Football Made Simple.
It was a crucial encounter between Barcelona and Inter, as both giants were looking to inch closer to the knockout phase. Barca in particular desperately needed the win, but in the end, this thrilling match ended 3-3, thanks to Dembele and a Lewandowski double for Barca, whilst Martinez, Barella and Gosens netted for Inter. The XG showed that the scoreline was fair, with both sides leaking, but let's take a closer look at Xavi and Barcelona's tactics. And if you're into fantasy football, join me on Spitch through the link down below, which is my favorite fantasy football app. And when you join a paid pitch, you have a chance of winning real money on Spitch, if you pick your team wisely. The best part is, your score resets every week, so no matter which week you choose to play, you have just as good a chance of winning as anyone. Spitch also awards players points for tackles, interceptions, passes and so much more, so it's not just about goals and assists, making it a much more tactical version of fantasy football. Here's how my team looked during the last Premier League weekend, with the likes of Haaland, Foden and Kane doing well for me. If this sounds good, download Spitch for free through the link in the description below. Let's start with how Barca were in possession. Inter were happy to generally sit in this deeper shape when Barcelona had the ball, so Barca could come out of the first phase relatively unchallenged. And in Barcelona's last match against Inter, they looked to line up in a 2-3-5, which looked something like this, with Alonso either forming a back three to make it a 3-2-5 or moving into the midfield. But generally the problem Xavi had with this solution is that it meant man-to-man situations in deeper zones, so they couldn't overload the backline as they usually like to do, due to this 5 versus 5. But in this match, Xavi showed he's more adaptable than some think, and took inspiration from Cruyff. This was by choosing to line up in a 3-4-3 diamond that looked something like this. Alonso would form the third centre-back, whilst Roberto would be in the midfield, with Rafinha and Dembele holding the width. And this shape had many advantages for Barca, both deeper on the pitch as well as higher up. So you can see Eric Garcia, Piqué and Alonso form a back three, and with a midfield diamond with Busquets at the base, Roberto at right central midfield, Pedri at attacking midfield, and Xavi at left central midfield. And spearheading the attack is Dembele on the left, Lewandowski as well as Rafinha out of shot. So the first advantage this granted Barcelona was that they had a 3 versus 2 advantage against the forwards, so Garcia and Alonso could spread particularly wide. And Alonso was more likely to get onto the ball and then drive higher up the pitch. And when he did, there was the threat of a wide overload, with Xavi then moving into one half space, Pedri into the other, and Busquets coming along, so there could start to be a 4 versus 3, meaning that Inter had to shift across, usually by committing one midfielder to stop the progress of Alonso, which would drag the team across. If he was not quickly confronted, this could also potentially draw centre-backs out of position, creating space in the back line. So Barcelona have that nice wide back three, and it's outside the width of the Inter front two, meaning that Alonso has space in which to drive forward. At the same time, we can see that Xavi is located in the half space and has already begun to drag Skriniar out of position. So when Xavi gets on the ball, we can see that space is now created in the back 5, which has now shifted to a back 4. Inter is now disoriented, and Pedri in attacking midfield has taken up this zone, as Roberto has pushed up from right central midfield. So when Pedri receives, now Lewandowski can make the run into the space vacated by Skriniar due to the movement of Xavi. But this shape also gave Barcelona another option in possession that they didn't have in the first leg. As discussed in the first leg, it was a front 5. So even when Barcelona looked to enact a side overload, they couldn't open up a switch to the winger, as they would always be tracked in these man-to-man situations. But now, this 3-4-3 diamond would quickly shift into a 3-1-6, with Roberto, rather than staying deep in midfield, moving into the half space, meaning that the front line often looked like this, as they tried everything to overload the back line. So, Barca could then create a side overload. Most important was the freedom of Roberto to operate in this position, because then DeMarco couldn't immediately commit to Rafinha. He had to hold this in-between position in case Roberto made this run. This opened up the temporary space needed to enact this switch to Rafinha, and then when DeMarco came out, Roberto would be able to make the run to receive the ball, although Mkhitaryan was often assigned with then dropping in to look to track him. The difference is, in the first leg with the front 5, let's say the man in the half space was Pedri, he would have been tracked by a centre-back whose body positioning would mean that he was already facing the forward, so could much more easily track any runs. So here you can see our rough front six. And the positioning of Roberto there means that DiMarco can't commit to Rafinha too early, as there would be potential for him to run into the space vacated. Although you can see that there is some responsibility on Mkhitaryan to track Roberto. So now when Rafinha does receive, there's an interesting situation here. As you can see, Mkhitaryan is technically picking up Roberto, but he doesn't have the defensive instinct of a natural centre-back. And you can see that if it was the centre-back tracking the run of Roberto, he has a head start and a much better body position to see the movements of Roberto. But the centre-back is preoccupied with Pedri, again because of this front six. So although he doesn't receive the ball, we can see that he would have been free if Rafinha was able to slip him in. And all of this contributes to the goal. So you can see that initially the presence of Roberto does make DiMarco slightly hesitant to be too tight to Rafinha. At the same time, Çalhanoğlu as always is picking him up. DiMarco does do well in challenging Rafinha, but the ball does still break to him. Now, as discussed, Mkhitaryan doesn't have the defensive awareness of a natural centre-back, so even from this position, there's the potential for Roberto to make runs, and he's able to receive it from Rafinha and cut it back to Dembele. But on paper, another advantage of this 3-4-3 diamond for Barcelona was that it gave them a 4 versus 3 in the midfield. But for the most part, Inter were able to cancel this out well, because Dzeko and Martinez would operate extremely deep, so that they were basically midfielders, making this into a 5 versus 4. But of course in open plays, there would be situations either when the centre forwards didn't track back, or they were just caught out of position, and this caused Inter major problems. When Busquets received, Çalhanoğlu was cautious of giving him the space to dictate the game and pick out passes, so he was often keen to immediately press Busquets. But with Roberto and Xavi tying up Barella and Mkhitaryan, Pedri would have a lot of space between the lines, so he could receive off of Busquets and then look to drive forward and find a penetrating pass. And this is a perfect example, once again, Barcelona with their midfield diamond. And because their two forwards are pressing high, they can't be a part of the midfield. So now Çalhanoğlu has moved up from his defensive midfield position to cover Busquets. As you can see, it means that Pedri has acres of space in the midfield in which to potentially operate, and even a centre-back is beginning to be drawn out towards him. So when the ball finds Garcia, we can see that Roberto has still tied up Mkhitaryan, and Çalhanoğlu is still recovering from having been tracking Busquets, meaning that Pedri is still in space. So now Pedri receives, drawing Çalhanoğlu, but the centre forwards are still out of the game, meaning there is still the potential for an overload. Now that Çalhanoğlu is on Pedri, Busquets is free to move up and receive the ball from Rafinha. And as discussed, Roberto's movements in this zone can draw two defenders effectively, meaning that Rafinha can now receive. And this leads to a cross in a dangerous zone, all from that one tactic. But as the game went on, Barca did at times look like they were running out of ideas. And the one option that the 3-1-6 did give them was overload in the box, as the wingbacks could be drawn in narrow temporarily. So we saw Rafinha and Dembele attempting a lot of crosses. In addition, when it was a 3-4-3 diamond, it meant that when they did lose the ball in central zones, it was easier for them to counterpress, as they had many men around the ball and could win it back. But this shape also has an obvious weakness, which is when there was a turnover. First of all, having a front two meant that they could immediately find the forwards who could look to combine against the back three at times. But this was also aided by the likes of DiMarco and Dumfries, who both have amazing engines and could get up the pitch immediately. And perhaps most importantly was Barella, who's technical and can run all day as well, and would drive the ball up the pitch and then look for the penetrative pass, leading to dangerous situations and a goal for Inter. So when the ball breaks down here, you can see that Barcelona have quite a few players the wrong side of the ball, as they're committed to the attack, and Barella is between the lines, so he can receive and drive up the pitch, and Dumfries was always looking to join the attack, as well as the two centre forwards, and DiMarco, who in this case is lagging slightly behind. This would consistently lead to dangerous situations for Inter throughout the 90. But even in possession, they could exploit Barca at times. They would basically give Barcelona a taste of their own medicine, with Dzeko moving to centre forward, Martinez into the left half space, and Barella into the right half space, which would then force Roberto to come in narrower, in order to prevent him being 2 versus 1 against the centre forwards. This would mean that time and again, the switch was on for Inter, but they just couldn't make the most of it. This result means qualification is now out of Barcelona's hands, but they are still in the equation. Xavi will be disappointed as he stuttered in a few big matches. For the tactical score, Xavi does earn a 6 for the new and mostly effective shape, but he didn't handle the transition well, so he's docked points for that. Inzaghi's plan worked, but they did give up a few chances, meaning that he too earns a 6, but drop your ratings down below.
But that's all for today, and remember, keep it simple.